Ambassador Nirupama Menon, former Foreign Secretary of India. Very good afternoon and welcome to Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Today we will be talking on the China factor in South Asia and Indian perspective. To talk on this important topic, we have Ambassador Nirupama Menon. Nirupama Menon is a retired Indian diplomat, former Foreign Secretary and Ambassador. She joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1973. During her 4-decade-long diplomatic career, she held several important assignments. She was India's first woman spokesperson in the Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, and the first woman High Commissioner for her country in Sri Lanka, and the first Indian woman ambassador to People's Republic of China. She served as India's Foreign Secretary from 2009 to 2011. At the end of that term, she was appointed India's ambassador to the United States, where she served for a term of 2 years from 2011 to 2013. On her retirement from active diplomatic service, Ambassador Rao entered the world of academics with an appointment as Meera and Bikram Gandhi Foundation Fellow at the India Initiative at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Ms. Rao has continued to pursue her academic interest and taught an undergraduate seminar at Brown University titled India in the World in 2015 and 2016. She has published a book on India-China relationship titled Tell It to the Mountain, India and China, 1949 to 1962. In 2012, she was named as the global list in the 100 most influential women on Twitter by foreignpolicy.com. She is a recipient of the Vanitha Ratna Award of Government of Kerala in 2016, the Citizen Extraordinaire Award of the Rotary International Bangalore in 2018, and the Kalinga Karubaki Literary Award, which was in 2018. In November 2018, she received the Fellowship of Peace Award conferred by Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Center, Washington, D.C. In November 2014, the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund, New Delhi, announced the grant of prestigious Jawaharlal Nehru Fellowship to Ambassador Rao to enable her to work on completion of her book project on India-China relations. Rao was visiting scholar at the India-China Institute at the New School in New York during April to May 2016, and she was appointed as Public Policy Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. from June 2017 to end August 2017. She was a practitioner in residence in the Baleggio Center in Italy in November 2017. She is currently a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center. During fall 2018, Rao was appointed as George H. Ball Adjunct Professor at Columbia University and taught a course on India-China relations entitled India-China Relationship from Coexistence to Contest to Competition. In fall 2019, she was a Pacific Leadership Fellow at the School of Global Politics and Strategy, University of California. In retirement, Ambassador Rao has also pursued her passion for music and poetry. She released her album titled Peace in My Dream and her book of poems called Rain Rising, which was published in 2004. Rao is a member of the Board of Governors of Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, and member of the Advisory Council of National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, and counselor on the World Refugee Council. She is also a member of the Board of Trustee of Narigya Gram, Odisha Dance Trust, Bangalore, and a member of Board of Trustee of the Museum of Arts and Photography, Bangalore, and on the India Trustee Board of the American India Foundation. She is a member of the Advisory Council of the Women in Public Service Project, the Wilson Center, Washington, D.C. She is an independent director of the board of ITC Limited, KEC International Limited, and JSW Steel. Ambassador Rao, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, Pramod ji. It is indeed an honor and privilege to be a part of this webinar this afternoon at the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. I have admired the range of your activities and the scholarship and depth and profundity of the discussions that you have hosted and which I have avidly listened to quite regularly. Thank you for that warm introduction. I just have a small correction to make. My book, Telling It on the Mountain, India and China, 1949 to 1962, is still a work in progress. I hope to complete it by this year end. I know the topic has become very, very live because of the developments in our relations with China over the last few months. I hope you can hear me properly.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. I have been asked to speak about the topic of China in South Asia and Indian perspective. But first of all, I must start with the image of South Asia that I have grown quite accustomed to, because you did not mention it, but I am a founder trustee of the South Asian Symphony Foundation, which is a project aimed at building greater communication and harmony between musicians of South Asia, all the 8 countries of South Asia. And we have created a South Asian Symphony Orchestra in which there are members from Nepal also who play together, have developed habits of cooperation. And I invite you all to visit our website, www.symphonyofsouthasia.org, which will give you an insight into our activities. So thinking about the theme of this lecture, I cannot help feeling that we are at the crossroads in South Asia today. And this is especially so when I recall the words of the late assassinated Foreign Minister of Sri Lanka, Lakshman Kadirgamar, who died exactly 15 years ago in 2005, in the August of 2005. He would always say, and he said it to me also, I was High Commissioner in Sri Lanka at that time, that South Asia is an integer. I'm using a mathematical term, but you know, it's meant to be integrated. That is what the term signifies. Unfortunately, the reality speaks otherwise to us. So the arrested development of SARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, points to several constraints, whether historical, political, lack of focus on priorities such as connectivity, including building bridges between our peoples, our youth, lack of an emphasis on trade and technology, and the challenges of creating livelihoods for our youth dividend. We keep talking about our demographic dividend. And this is against the backdrop of what is an impending 4th industrial revolution. And our everyday lives have to be depoliticized, I've always felt. You know, our everyday in South Asia is too politicized. And if SARC has to revive, our everyday lives have to be depoliticized. The question facing us is, can sovereignty be trumped by integration and the spirit of open democracy and the fundamental freedoms that we should enjoy? Let me emphasize also that we in India, most of us disabuse ourselves of any obsession, and I want to say this to our friends in Nepal, any obsession with India being a mega state or a Jambudvipa in SARC. Ideally, my vision of an India in South Asia is of a leader of democratic values, federalism, and devolution within all countries of the region. I believe that successful regionalism can bring potent growth to all the countries in the region, and that is the only way that we can become a geopolitical actor in the world, in the larger region, through the combination of our strengths in the region. And the problem is that we have always considered or tended to consider South Asia as an arena rather than a region. So I wanted to place my comments in that context. Now, today we have the tensions between India and Pakistan, India and China, which have inscribed a deepened dissonance in the region. Now, the India-Pakistan relationship, I always call it one that was truly conceived in hell and condemned to eternal purgatory, hostility, and prejudice. Unfortunately, Pakistan did not take the advice from its iron brother, China, in 1996, when the then president of China, Jiang Zemin, urged Pakistan to take, and I quote, a long perspective view on issues that cannot be resolved for the time being, meaning, unquote, meaning that they should be shelved temporarily so that relations could be developed in all other areas of human need and endeavor. So diplomacy seems to be in a near-death situation between India and Pakistan today. Now, the China case, again, the India-China relationship is a story of promise denied and potential unfulfilled. And Galwan has upset the incidents in the Galwan Valley last month in Ladakh have upset the whole structure of the bilateral relationship built since 1988, when then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited China, necessitating deep introspection in India about the need for strategic rebalancing. The BRI and the CPEC have created additional complications. The latter seems to have greater political logic for China and Pakistan than economic, in my view. And one of our Indian analysts, Dr. Jabin Jacob, recently described it as an equivalent of, I quote, a Potemkin village in a self-sustaining loop, unquote. And today, of course, the COVID-19 situation has not really helped matters. We see, the disjointedness in the region, however much our leaders and Prime Minister Modi convened a much welcomed meeting of all the SAARC leaders to discuss responses to the COVID situation. But we seem to have gone on our own way. And again, this is yet another example of the disjointed way in which we have tackled the subject of regional connectivity and integration in this particular instance. And today we also have the pull of the vision of a free and independent Indo-Pacific against the specter of the death of engagement between US and China. The strengthening of the comprehensive global and strategic partnership between India and the United States, you see that too, and the rise of the quadrilateral security dialogue, call it the Quad or a diamond, still an idea in the making. It's a diplomatic instrument with security characteristics capable of morphing into the bilateral, the trilateral, the quadrilateral, or even more multifaceted. It must be emphasized, as also observed recently, that the Quad is not a grand coalition against China, headquartered in Washington. I quote this. Actually, the collection of China's competitors is quite fuzzy and quite ill-defined in my view. But we are faced today, and we are faced with it in our region of South Asia today also, the very palpable assertiveness of a powerful China. And I will speak briefly on the India-China relationship, but looking at the region, the replacement of US unipolarity by multipolarity in our region with, I must emphasize, a binary preoccupation arising out of the strategic competition between the US and China. That's what we face today. These are the two leading global powers. But in my view, multipolarity, it's a healthy trend. And as it has also been noted by other analysts, it promotes greater maneuverability in the region. And that's what we need, particularly for the smaller countries. And you see that in the ASEAN conglomerate also. Now, the need for our neighborhood is to define a consonant and shared, mutually beneficial vision of how we can achieve what I call a South Asia 2050 paradigm that is steeped in greater integration, connectivity across many sectors, including people, stressing open democratic values, respect for diversity, good governance, and restoring the idea of South Asia. Now, since the focus is on China and South Asia, let me brief you on recent developments in India-China relations. Now, the Galwan incident represents a watershed in our relations with China. And can it really be business as usual with China after, we lost 20 soldiers on the night of June 15? This was the first incident involving bloodshed along the line of actual control in the India-China border areas since October of 1975. So for 45 years, we had held the peace along the India-China border, and this was broken on June 15th. So the calculus of relations has been disturbed, and the mood is very somber. There's a lot of distrust of China in India, and even all through these years, because of the experience of 1962, when we had the border conflict, that distrust and that suspicion has lingered below the surface of seeming bonhomie, and is embedded in the Indian psyche. Our policymakers tried over the last few decades to craft a modus vivendi with China. And we did. But now, how do we avoid a slide into conflict and confrontation? Because that approach that we built has been clearly stressed and fractured. So, in my view, we need cool-headed thinking, because we cannot and we must avoid a slide into paranoia and hysteria. That will not help us, because I believe that a reincarnated battlefront with China we can't embrace blindly. It will not work. And we need sober, studied, and calibrated diplomacy. Diplomacy is an ancient profession. It wins over the battlefield on most occasions, and it builds more secure futures than conflict does. And we have not exhausted the avenues for diplomacy with China, and both countries need to deal with each other with reason and maturity, with full awareness of the past in our relations, of the lessons we learned from that. Obviously, there's no diplomatic talisman to improve the relationship or solve the problems. And but what are the reasons for recent Chinese behavior? I think I should speak about that also. As far as India is concerned, I think there's a view held by many of us that the Chinese foreign and security policy today is rather opportunistic. It is obsessively intent on the defense of national sovereignty, and there's no harm in defending national sovereignty. I'm not saying that. India wants that too. I'm sure Nepal wants that too. But we're seeing a very muscular and assertive attitude in the reinforcement of their claims along the line of actual control in the India-China border areas. It's true that India's presence in these areas is much more visibly asserted. And therefore, when we see the high operational alertness of our military in these areas and the Chinese muscularity and assertiveness, the two together do make for a kinetic additive. And on top of that, we have differing perceptions of the line of actual control in some areas. But across the board, we feel China has paid short shrift to the factor of sensitivity in dealings with China, and that has led to an erosion of mutual trust. Now, China is quite a different country from the first generation People's Republic that we saw in the 50s and 60s of the last century. And nationalism is the wolf's milk on which a whole post-Tiananmen generation has been nurtured. And there's a sense of entitlement in the power of their strength and resources, and this can be quite intimidating to the rest of the world. I was just reading the other day that even within ASEAN, when they took a survey, the Chinese emerged as the most distrusted country. So I think there is a problem here that China has to address. And the other thing is that, is China as a great power? What is the idea that China is trying to purvey to the world? In my experience, the language of Chinese diplomacy, especially the diplomacy of the Chinese Communist Party, despite the huge changes in the country, the reform, the opening up, the integration, the globalization with the rest of the world, is still very much the language of the long march. And it's imbued with a style that suggests suspicion, secrecy. It aims at restoring Chinese greatness. It's all very different from what we are accustomed to in a democratic environment. Edward Luttwak, the American strategic analyst, keeps saying that China suffers from great power autism. Of course, that can be discussed many ways. But the challenge, we are facing a challenge from China, and we've tried to address that challenge and make the necessary adjustments within a very free and energetic foreign policy that we espouse today. We don't call it non-aligned anymore, but it's certainly very free and makes its own decisions on the alignments and the interests that we need to protect and preserve for our own national interest and progress and the transformation of India. So therefore, we've sought a closer relationship with the United States, with the other American democracy. And we've pursued our relationship with the United States with the full awareness of where we stand in the region and the sensitivity of ties with China. We have a relationship with Japan also that is particularly strong because it brings great benefits in terms of infrastructure development, the flow of capital, technology, innovation, counterterrorism, public health, strong people-to-people ties. The same goes for the United States. The defense and security partnership has also grown stronger, but we would like to utilize this to project and preserve and promote an order which enhances respect for international law, established codes of conduct, and the strengthening of interdependence and interoperability also within our security establishments and intelligence gathering, because we want a peaceful regional order that preserves freedom of navigation, for instance, in the ocean, Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, through which much of our trade passes today. 42% of India's GDP depends on our external trade. So that is extremely important. And so our partnerships with these countries are valuable assets. And we feel the need to ensure high visibility for them at this time of great stress and the challenge that we face from China. So we would like all this to be in the line of vision of the Chinese. So here we are at a turning point, as I said, and at the same time, we have China's presence in South Asia, which is really the subject of the talk today, although I feel the relationship between India and China is also very valid to our discussion. So how does India view China in South Asia? Now, as I study the extent of China's relations with South Asia, much of what it is building, apart from its relations with the Indian Ocean countries of Sri Lanka and the Maldives and Bangladesh to some extent, a lot of the connections that China is building with South Asia is an extension from China's periphery, from Tibet and Xinjiang. And in fact, the areas of Tibet bordering our region of South Asia make you realize that the Tibet Autonomous Region is very much what you would call Chinese South Asia, although nobody refers to it as such. But despite the fact that these peripheries border us in South Asia, there's very little connection at the people level between those regions and our region of South Asia. And what we have called, and in fact, I have attended a few of these summits, track 2 summits in Kathmandu, Himalayan Consensus Summits, you may be aware of that. But a Himalayan consensus really does not exist between China and South Asia today. And the border peoples, the peoples of these peripheries are the missing segments. So where is their agency and how do they navigate the complexity of these growing ties with South Asia? Of course, China has extensive resources, deep pockets, and the extension of its influence in South Asia is a very real factor that we have to consider when we look at the situation in South Asia today. Its relations with Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, not to mention the relationship with Pakistan, which is perhaps one of the oldest relations besides China, besides India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka that China has with our region. And as I mentioned, the CPEC, the whole project involving the CPEC, and the fact that it runs the alignment of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor runs through territory in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which is claimed by India, and from which stem all the problems that we have with the BRI project and the CPEC project as promoted by China. So what is China's worldview? I think as South Asians, we have to consider that. I think within ASEAN, for instance, which is the nearest grouping that I can see as relative to SAARC, for instance. If we can talk about BIMSTEC and the Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Nepal corridor, Bhutan corridor. But let us look at what China's worldview is. It talks of a community of shared destiny or common destiny. Now, how do you define the word common? Is it common as defined by China, or is it something that talks of mutuality, where we exchange ideas and come to a shared view of our future? But a lot of people point to the fact that China is promoting a hierarchy of a world regional order with at the base with Chinese leadership at the apex. Chinese leadership providing guidance, first principles for operating the system. There is a constant emphasis that this model is superior to the Western model. We see a lot of Chinese nationalism undergirding this definition. There are convictions about the greatness and righteousness of China. It's an extremely centralized model of power. So my view, big countries have a duty to reassure smaller countries. And I would include India also, although India is a big country in terms of size and in terms of economic resource and strength. Today, it is smaller than China. So in this sphere, in terms of how China can reassure the rest of the world, as Ambassador Bilahari Kaushikan of Singapore has said, China has singularly underperformed. So this is a trust issue that we in India, being very frank and candid in this forum, I must say, face vis-a-vis China. Of course, our neighbors in South Asia are sovereign. They can make their own decisions, but balance and equilibrium is definitely needed for us as a region. We cannot abandon the need to define a mutually agreed vision for what South Asia is and what South Asia is meant to be. And our neighbors within South Asia, when they look at India, must also decide what the pace of their cooperation should be and what their future vision of ties with India today. So we face a lot of challenges today, this disequilibrium, as it were, in a place where we want equilibrium, where we want more balancing, where we want more integration. Perhaps we in South Asia, and India has a definite responsibility in this regard. We have, there's been alacrity in the pace with which we promoted the idea of integration. And so many problems have intervened in the interregnum. And now we have arisen China, which is entrenched in the region and with which we must deal, and with which India particularly has a huge relationship, whether it's economic, whether it's political, whether it's multilateral. And we cannot obviously turn our backs on China. We have a 3,500 kilometer long boundary with China. It's one of the longest land boundaries in the world. And at the same time, we border almost every South Asian country, land border, apart from Afghanistan. And of course, Sri Lanka is literally a heartbeat away from India, if you look at the narrowness of the Pork Strait. And then you have the Maldives, and the outer reaches of the Maldives archipelago are very close to our state of Kerala and the Lakshadweep and Minicoy Islands. So complicated situation. I thought I'd just start with these remarks and we can go to the question answers.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for your initial remarks. Now let us begin the discussion. All of these questions are posted by our participants. It's not prepared by us. So let's go to the first question. How do you look at India's neighborhood first policy? Where does northern neighbor China fits in it? Is it possible to fit all its neighbors such as China, Pakistan, and other Nepal and Bhutan into one policy?
The neighborhood first policy is obviously focused on our neighborhood, which is our South Asian neighborhood. China is both an East Asian country, as you know, and also, in a sense, it borders South Asia. But traditionally and conventionally, we have never regarded it within the definition of South Asia and the neighborhood as we conventionally see it. Now, China is a neighbor of India, but we have to look at it as a sui generis case when it comes to policy and policy definitions and policy outlook and the measures that we take as far as advancement of the bilateral relationship is concerned. Now, when Prime Minister Modi invited South Asian leaders to his inauguration swearing in 2014, he invited the SARC region leaders, essentially. So that's how we have viewed the neighborhood first policy. And you can argue that India needs to focus more intensively on this neighborhood first policy. I don't think it's for a want of good intentions on the part of India, but there have been many, running the foreign policy of a country can be a huge proposition. And the kind of challenges that we have faced in recent years really crowd upon the desks of many, I'm sure, of our NEA bureaucrats and the political leadership also. But by and large, I believe, the government of Prime Minister Modi has paid a great deal of attention to the neighborhood. And Prime Minister Modi's profile in the region has been of very high visibility in terms of the visits he's made. He's gone to countries which had not been visited for 2-3 decades. For instance, Sri Lanka, even Nepal. I think he was a leader from India, Prime Minister was visiting, I think, after more than 2 decades, if I'm not mistaken. He even went to Pakistan, dropped in on Nawaz Sharif in Pakistan. So unfortunately, with that relationship, we have faced continuing complications, and that has in many ways eroded the whole project, I think, of South Asian unity, which is unfortunate.
Thank you, ma'am. Let us move to the second question. What are the soft power domains that India can employ to influence South Asia over the lucrative that China presents to Indian neighbors?
I think soft power on its own, it's of course, it's a very feel-good proposition when you talk of civilizational and cultural shared space, as it were, in South Asia, which is a fact. I mean, history and geography apart, we also have our civilizational values and cultural domains that unite us really rather than separate us. But soft power itself has to be combined, I think, with smart diplomacy. Even if you set aside hard power, because I think, I'm sure South Asian neighbors are not looking at the demonstrations of Indian hard power, but certainly we need a combination of soft power and smart diplomacy when it comes to India's dealings in the region.
Similarly, India and China have excellent economic engagement between them, and there is huge trade among themselves. But why is India concerned when China has economic engagement with India's smaller neighbors like Nepal or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh sometimes?
I personally don't see, any reason for us to object to the economic engagement that our smaller neighbors, I mean, I'm using your adjective, but I will say our neighbors in South Asia have with China, because, these are sovereign countries and they have the right and they have the space in which to make these decisions. But as I think one of your compatriots, George Burgess, was saying in a webinar recently, in a conversation with Constantino Xavier of the Brookings India, this whole concept of equidistance, how do our neighbors in South Asia determine that? It's all very well to say in principle that we will follow a policy of equidistance between India and China. But the fact is that, doing business with India and integration with India is so much more easy for our South Asian neighbors than for them to do it with China. So that's the only point I would like to suggest to you for your consideration.
Thank you, ma'am. Next is India is not happy with Hambantota port constructed by Chinese in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka had initially asked India to construct it, which was refused by India. If it was of strategic importance to India, why did India allow it to go into Chinese hand? Did India wanted Sri Lanka to fall into quote-unquote death trap and learn the lesson for engaging with Chinese?
I think that's a very convoluted argument, with all due respect to the questioner. The Hambantota port, of course, ultimately the Sri Lankan government decided. It is true that they first sounded us on whether we would like to take it on. From India's point of view, I believe that the decision at that time was that we should look for economically viable projects to undertake in Sri Lanka and in our neighborhood also. And the economic viability of the Hambantota port project, if I may humbly submit, is still in question. You will agree. And we did not want Sri Lanka definitely to fall into a debt trap. Sri Lanka is one of our closest friends. And as Gandhiji said, there's no question of any quarrel between India and Sri Lanka. We are so close. And essentially, that's what I think within Sri Lanka we should be. We should be that band of brothers. We keep talking of big brother and, the India's approach. Let's not look at it like that. Let us just be a band of brothers. And with Sri Lanka, we would never have wanted Sri Lanka to fall into a debt trap. But at that time, when they decided to take it on, they must have gone into it with their eyes open, no doubt, but with perhaps without the benefit of that foresight. Unfortunately, all of us sometimes go into these decisions without knowing what the future holds. So it turned out to be an extremely costly project for Sri Lanka, and ultimately they had to exchange that debt by giving Chinese equity in Hambantota and leasing out many thousands of acres of land for a period of 99 years. So that's the story of Hambantota, and today it is cited as an example of how a small country became very deeply indebted to a bigger country, and which points to a larger question about BRI projects, because is there sufficient transparency? Most of them, I think 99% of them are based on loans and lines of credit. They are not grant projects. They are not like overseas development assistance like the Japanese have given in many countries. So this is a Chinese model that you have to understand and comprehend better before you enter into projects of this nature, because they can prove very costly for the recipient country.
Thank you, ma'am. You just mentioned about BRI. So let me talk about BRI. Why has India not joined China's Belt and Road Initiative? How can China make a favorable environment for India to join BRI?
I think as a democracy which is completely devoted to accountability, transparency, the rule of law, anti-corruption. I'm not saying that all these issues apply completely to the BRI, but the way we look at projects, the way our partners look at projects, the way I'm sure many of the South Asian democracies look at projects. For instance, Sri Lanka is the region's oldest democracy in many ways, oldest republic in many senses. So Sri Lanka should also follows these terms and conditions. Unfortunately, I think with the BRI, the way it has been presented by China, it's this larger than life linkage that China is building with the rest of the world. A lot of countries have been swayed by the information that has come out from China on this issue. I think they have to look more closely and look more deeply and scrutinize each project much more in depth. And that is why India has not joined the BRI, apart from the problems with the CPEC, because the CPEC is touted as the flagship project of the BRI, if you're aware. This linkage that China is building across the Karakoram Mountains to Gwadar Port, to the Gwadar Port, which overlooks the Straits of Hormuz, extremely strategic position, no doubt. But again, when I talked of the Himalayan consensus and how peoples in the border areas are left out, I was reading a piece the other day about the Karakoram Highway, which is essentially the CPEC, and how people in the border areas in Gilgit and Baltistan and the areas bordering Xinjiang have seen with the CPEC that is essentially container after container that moves along the highways. The local people, in the border regions, have very little benefit from the appearance or the progress on this project. So you have to think about the benefits also, apart from the larger benefits that they are talking to, for Pakistan and the Pakistan economy. Let's see how that progresses. But at the level of the people in those areas who should have also benefited, I think, from these projects, there are questions. And that, I'm sure, is also something that would apply to countries like Nepal. You border the Tibet Autonomous Region, and there's a lot of talk of connectivity. Lhasa, Shigatse to Kathmandu via the Kirong, I think that's the place. So think about this also more carefully.
Ma'am, there is discussion in India on boycotting of Chinese product. Can India afford to boycott Chinese goods? What will be its impact on Indian economy and India-China relations?
I think the government is taking very well-considered steps in this direction. I'm not privy, of course, to all the decisions that are being made. They took the decision to ban those 59 apps, and obviously in areas of critical infrastructure and where Chinese involvement or investment would affect national security, I'm sure there will be many projects will be reconsidered, and the whole issue of Huawei and the 5G connectivity would also fall, I think, within the ambit of that decision making. But on the other hand, there's been a lot of interdependence that has grown up between Chinese and Indian businesses and investors. And we have Indian businesses and companies that operate in China for many, many years now. Similarly, we have Chinese companies that operate in India. They have brought employment, no doubt, for Indians. And the problem, I think, that also concerns our policymakers is the very, very large trade deficit with China. And that has not been addressed by China all this time, even where we have sought entry, the removal of non-tariff barriers for some of our own products, things like pharmaceuticals, our IT products, for instance. So there has not been any give from China on that front. So there will be, I'm sure, an emphasis on decoupling from China in the field, for instance, of import of cheap goods, which could easily be manufactured in India, where we need to revive manufacturing. Many of these things were produced in India 20, 30 years ago, and they have gone out of business because of the entry of Chinese goods. So maybe this will be a wake-up call for us to revive our medium, small-scale enterprises, revive manufacturing, creating jobs within India, improve the ease of doing business for foreign companies wanting to come to India, even as we try to promote self-reliance and Atmanirbharta in many of these areas. But the ease of doing business should certainly be in focus. And maybe, for instance, in the field of active pharmaceutical ingredients, which are a huge component of imports from China for our very critical pharmaceutical industry, I hope that we will be able to build more self-reliance, for instance, in this area.
Thank you, ma'am. India's relation with China before and after Modi government, is there any changes? What are the continuity and what are the changes in the relations before Modi and after Modi government?
I think there is continuity and there is change also. Continuity because, as I said, the model of relations that we were able to structure from 1988 onwards was essentially continued. But there was a greater visibility because I think Prime Minister Modi reached out to President Xi Jinping and sought to develop a personal rapport with President Xi Jinping. And as you know, after the Doklam crisis of the summer of 2017, when relations were clearly in crisis, Mr. Modi made a special effort to reach out to Mr. Xi Jinping, and they met in Wuhan. As you know, there was talk of the Wuhan spirit, and it was essentially an overture that was made by India in order to build bridges, build more confidence in the relationship with China. And so I believe there was continuity, but there was also enhancement in the positive sense of communication between the leadership of the two sides. And in these last 5-6 years, since 2014, the business and economic relationship has grown exponentially, especially in the field of investment. And it's unfortunate that tensions along the line of actual control have now disturbed the calculus of those relations.
Thank you, ma'am. Uh, how do you look at the recent India-China border standoff? What is the reason behind tension between India and China? Does China want to warn India not to approach United States?
I don't think India is a country that can be warned by any other country. Just I'm sure, as I'm sure Nepal would feel if somebody said you were being warned by any country. So China cannot warn India. India takes its own sovereign decisions, and that includes the relationship with the United States. Um, as far as the reasons for the border standoff, I think I mentioned it briefly in my opening remarks. Uh, China and India have improved their infrastructure in the areas along the line of actual control, and that means both sides, are rubbing up against each other, and there are more, situations where tensions arise. You saw that happening in 2013, in 2014. You saw that happening in 2017 in Doklam, and now, of course, you have the Galwan incident, and you have the standoff in Pangong So, for instance, and the intrusion, Chinese intrusion, I believe, in the Dexang Plains area near the Karakoram Pass. So, unfortunately, the five protocols and the arrangements that we had put in place from 1993 onwards to maintain peace and tranquility in the border areas along the line of actual control are very, very good understandings, very detailed, very comprehensive in the areas they cover about use of arms, prevention of violence, how to deal with situations where tension arises, border meetings. The scope is quite wide and comprehensive of those agreements. Unfortunately, they did not work in the case of Galwan. So we have to go back to the drawing board after the disengagement and de-escalation happens to see how we can prevent these situations from happening in future. One major issue, as I see it, is the lack of a joint verification of the line of actual control in the border areas between India and China. This joint verification was one of the areas where both sides had agreed to sit down and complete the task in the agreement, the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement of 1996, the second one that we signed. And it was repeated again in 2005 also that we should do it. But unfortunately, we started that exercise with China, but it did not proceed. It did not get completed. Because the Chinese had some reservations, and the indications are that they are unwilling to proceed with this exercise in the future also, which is really quite unfortunate, because if we have a jointly verified line of actual control, then we understand what are the pockets where there are differences, where tensions could arise, and then we can evolve a scheme of disengagement and de-escalation so that this is taken care of. At the same time, we continue our efforts to reach a negotiated settlement of the boundary, which is not going to be easy because we have the differences in claims, we have the Chinese approach, we have the Indian approach. We did arrive at a set of guiding principles and political parameters for the settlement of the boundary question in 2005, 15 years ago. But progress after that has been somewhat slow, which is all the more reason why we should avoid tension in the line of actual areas along the line of actual control. We must maintain a peaceful border pending a settlement of the boundary question, pending a peaceful settlement of the boundary question. It's very important because India and China are two Asian powers. China is already a global. It's with the United States, they are the two lead. China and the United States are the two leading powers. But India's economy is up there in the front ranks of the world economies, and India has the potential and has the promise. Everybody is agreed to be also a global power in the foreseeable future. So this is the time for India and China to really craft a long-term perspective on their relations. A comprehensive one, a multifaceted one, because on that will also depend, and on that also hinges, I think, the future of the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is, how far is it pragmatic that India would strategically align with the US by overlooking its deep ties with Russia in order to counter its immediate neighbor, China?
Well, I don't think we are entering into any alliance with any country. I think India proceeds on the basis of its interests, and it aligns with various countries based on the issues involved. And with the United States, it is true that our relationship over the last 15, 16 years has grown exponentially in many, many areas. And that is what sets the relationship with the United States apart. It's not only a defense and security relationship, it's a relationship between two great democracies. And I'm not using these words in an empty fashion. I say it with some sense of responsibility. It's a relationship that embraces people to people contacts between the two countries, science, education, technology, health, um, outer space, agriculture. So the United States and India are, their interests are intertwined in many ways. So it's a global, comprehensive, strategic partnership today. So that is something that India benefits from, and the United States also benefits from. With Russia, our relationship, India-Russia relationship, is very, very important to us. Of course, you know the defense component of that relationship. But apart from that, Russia has been our friend, has been India's friend, and has been a mainstay for India in the past, if you remember the Cold War days. At times of when India was isolated, when the United States was reaching out to China, when it was using Pakistan as the bridge to reach out to China, you know, that Nixonian expedition to China that the United States undertook via, and Pakistan was used to reach out really by Henry Kissinger to China. So at that time also Russia was a friend, was a partner, and India does not forget, never forgets its friends. And I think no country can, or no, even in human relationships, you don't forget your friends. So India and Russia, there's a good rapport between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. Russia is the only other country with which we have informal summits, and we have an annual summit every year. The next one is going to happen in October. And last year when Prime Minister Modi was in Russia, he visited Vladivostok, as you know. And there was this, and Vladivostok is very much the Russian Pacific. It's the Pacific coast of Russia. And Russia, besides China, United States and China, it's the third global power. It may be a power that is not on the ascendant as China is, but it certainly has a large imprint on the global stage. So it's important. We consider our relationship with Russia also very important. And we feel that I think Russia should revise its opinions about the Indo-Pacific. If you recall, Foreign Minister Lavrov at the Raisina dialogue early this year kind of tended to sort of trash the concept. I think it needs a kind of review from the Russian part, because Russia has interests in the Indo-Pacific. For instance, in the Philippines, I think it's involved with counterterrorism. With a number of Indonesia is an old friend of Russia. There are many interests that Russia has in the region. Apart from its interests in South Asia, Russia is a Eurasian power, and it's also a power that stretches across Europe into Asia. So it should look at the maritime environment surrounding it also, which really involves the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, ma'am. There are debates in India regarding the need of rethink on one China policy. Do you think India should renounce one China policy?
No, I don't believe there is any pressure on India to renounce its one China policy. For that matter, no country, no major player on the world stage is trying to recast their one China policy. Of course, Taiwan has been, in fact, they say it's the only Chinese democracy in Asia today, in a sense, because they embraced democracy 30 years ago, and they've made a great success of it. And Taiwan has many achievements in a number of fields which I think make it a standout place today. And we have trade and economic ties with Taiwan, and they have two offices, I think, in India. We have an office, a trade and Trade and Liaison Office in Taipei. And these contacts between the people of Taiwan and the people of India, I think, should certainly be pursued, and ties in trade and technology and human resource development, education, all that I think should be pursued and in fact be intensified in my view. But we have to worry about the situation concerning Taiwan as Chinese power increases, and there are also very, very clearly prevalent bellicose trends as far as China is concerned vis-a-vis Taiwan. You know, the exercises they do, the intrusions into Taiwanese airspace, the threats that are made on a regular basis to Taiwan. And I think that should be the focus of our worry, not the one China policy.
Thank you, ma'am. Recently, like when Nepal raised the issue of Kalapani-Lipule border issues, Indian Chief of Army Staff remarked that Nepal raised it under third-party provocation, hinting at China. So how do you look at it?
Well, I think he probably spoke sort of, it was a kind of, what shall I say, a Freudian slip, perhaps, as they say. Because I think in the hearts of every Indian, there is this lingering suspicion that perhaps China is kind of provoking certain situations of confrontation with India. I'm not saying there's proof to suggest that, but there is this feeling. And so in that sense, I think the Chief of the Army Staff was saying something that was perhaps lurking in almost every Indian mind, and perhaps you should not fault him for that, although as Chief of Army Staff, perhaps he could have weighed his words, let us say, more carefully. But you know, let us look at the larger relationship between India and Nepal, which is so close and so organic. I'm not using the word special because I know our Nepalese friends have some, you know, they kind of don't feel so comfortable with that, but the gravitational pull of Nepal, the pull from India, you know, the kind of pull that exists, that draws us as countries together, I think is something that you can never, none of us can have with China, which when you said, why didn't we include China in the neighborhood first policy? It's because of this kind of organic connectivity that exists, even if we don't have physical connectivity in the way we should have between your nation and my country, or for that matter, other South Asian countries and us. It's, you know, it's this language of commonality that we speak, even though we are in a region which is the least integrated in the world today, unfortunately, economically, particularly in terms of trade and connectivity. But the fact is, you know, that really is why when we speak out on certain issues, we speak with a lot of emotion, we speak with a lot of perhaps, we react in subjective ways. And that is very natural, I think, given our ties.
Like in the same context, there is like in the context of increasing Chinese influence in Nepal, what should be India's damage control strategy in Nepal, as it has lost a lot already here?
I wouldn't call it a damage control policy, but I think first and foremost, we should avoid emotionalism, rhetoric, hysteria, in the dialogue and in the interaction between the two countries at various levels. I think we should do that. And I think and Nepal is the primary determinant of the pace of progress that it wants in its relations with its cooperation, let's say, on projects, for instance, with India. And I think we should really try and deepen the trust between our two countries. You know, we should address the suspicions that exist, you know, all that, the problems that we now have on Kalapani, for instance. You know, perhaps we should have avoided a previous phase where there was too much complacency, too much, you know, we'll take it in our stride, we'll address it when it comes, we'll cross the bridges when we come to it. I think that approach should be avoided. We should sit down together and brother to brother, have this kind of dialogue, especially at the top leadership level between the two countries, to craft a mutually shared strategy. I don't want it to be something that India foists on Nepal or that Nepal foists on India. It has to be crafted together. And, Nepal's progress can only be achieved, I think, by greater cooperation in development with India, because we border each other. Our regions are contiguous to each other. When you are affected, we are affected. When you have a natural disaster, the first port of call is India. We come to help you because we feel we must. We are responsible, and we must. We are a responsible neighbor, and we feel we should help. And at the same time, if we can work together in terms of the development of energy, I know that we have not been able to do anything, for instance, in the hydropower field. And Nepal stands to benefit from that kind of progress. Whatever China is able to do for you, the connectivity, the projects, try and always think that what is best perhaps for your country is to have that kind of strategic balance between both your neighbors, so that you benefit from both. I'm not saying you should only benefit from India, and we say you should not just benefit from China. Try and benefit from both countries, and but don't make your own national domain an arena of infructuous competition between India and China, because it won't help you. So I think you should be the first. You should be able to see those danger signals before anybody else does, so that you can avert them.
Thank you, ma'am. How do we assess Trump's interest to meditate a dispute between South Asian region like Kashmir or India-China border dispute, although China and India have already rejected to it?
Well, it was, I think, an offer. The United States has always maintained that they're willing to do their bit to arbitrate or to mediate between, India and Pakistan, for instance. Now, President Trump has talked of India and China. But ultimately, I think they have also read the signals very clearly that such problems have to be resolved bilaterally between the countries concerned. These are very difficult problems, but both countries are well equipped to address them and to deal with these challenges. And that's what they've been doing over the years. And we need to sort this out ourselves. And I think the United States understands that position very well.
Similarly, like as you have mentioned in one of your interview with Karan Thapar, that one of the major problem in India is that since 1962 war with China is that there is no substantive research on China, and they lack enough understanding on China. So could you please clarify what is the current status? Has things really changed?
No, what I meant was, having lived and worked in the United States for some years, I see the body of scholarship on China and the extensive China knowing community, in academia, especially in academia, the language specialists, for instance, the history specialists, the diplomacy specialists, across the board in every field of endeavor, they have built that kind of expertise. And even I've seen it in Russia, there's a very deep scholarship of China. So I think in our region also of South Asia and India, for me, India first and foremost, being Indian, I feel we should develop that community of scholarship about China. I think this is the time when relations are stressed, when we should think particularly of that, because it's through that we can also create a kind of resilience in the relationship, so that it doesn't collapse like a house of cards, when there's one confrontation or there's, some tension in the border areas. Everything should not collapse overnight. There should be an inbuilt resilience into such relationships, because only then can we take considered decisions involving consultation with experts about the way forward and how we are able to introduce those permutations, those combinations, those adaptations that are needed in times like this.
Ma'am, do you think that China has dramatically increased its presence in South Asia? Because Chinese President Xi Jinping has visited almost all South Asian countries except Bhutan in very short
Yes, I think we all discussed it earlier in this webinar. China has greatly increased its presence in South Asia. There's no doubt about it. We see it in Nepal, for instance. It's in a very different place. I remember one meeting when I was ambassador in Beijing. I think it was when I was ambassador in Beijing. And at the time of the Maoist problems that Nepal was facing, and being asked by Chinese friends in the foreign ministry for advice on how to handle, the emerging situation. They felt that India had the expertise, had the knowledge, had the awareness, which we could share with China. Today, I think, the growth of Chinese presence in our region suggests a very different picture.
There's another question on Indo-Pacific. Do you think that COVID-19 has provided one of the major player, India, Indo-Pacific, the opportunity to make Quad more functional in both scope and scale?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand what the COVID-19?
Do you think that COVID-19 has provided India the opportunity to make Quad more functional in both scope and scale?
Oh, to make Quad, I don't think, it's a question linked to COVID-19, but I think it's a question more linked to the looming presence of China in our region. Not that, as I said earlier, that the Quad is not a kind of a centralized coalition against China with headquarters in Washington. That's not the case. I think the Quad has the capacity to enlarge its activities, not just military security, which is how people normally look at it, but there are many other areas in technology, in terms of how we are to deal with questions of the new industrial revolution facing us, the issues of innovation, how we can build countervailing coalitions within our region that address some of the major challenges that we are going to face regionally and as countries themselves. So I think that is really what these kinds of groupings, and the Quad is not the only grouping that one should be focused on. Our own relations with the ASEAN, which is central to the consideration of the Indo-Pacific, for instance. Our activities in the Indian Ocean region with countries, the Indian Ocean littoral states, for instance, and the groupings that we have in this regard, the IORA, the IONS, the Naval Symposium, BIMSTEC we mentioned, we have ASEAN, our connections with the Mekong region, with Japan, I think there are so many concentric combinations here, as it were.
Thank you, ma'am. There's another question very similar to Indian Ocean region. I'll just put the question and then, how do you perceive China's aim to dominate areas of the Indian Ocean to probably change over the course of incoming years? And there's another question very similar to that. Sometimes we read that BIMSTEC is an alternative to China's BRI. Do you think that BIMSTEC can emerge as an alternative to BRI, at least in the region? Does India have that capacity to challenge BRI in the region?
I don't think India has ever posited BIMSTEC as an alternative to BRI, so I'll leave it at that. And in terms of the Indian Ocean region, yes, the Chinese are far more active in the Indian Ocean region than they were in the past. The PLA, is much more visible in the waters of the Indian Ocean. And in terms of the what I would call the pivots that China has established in the region, in the port of Djibouti, where it calls it a replenishment presence that they are building, the development of Gwadar, the activities concerning Chittagong, Kyoikpu in Myanmar, Hambantota in Sri Lanka. These are all assets that China has developed in the last few years, and that could acquire a very different role, who knows, as the situation evolves, because China has never the positions that China has today may not be the positions that China has a decade down the line. So this is all part of a very rapidly evolving situation. But as we look at it in India, we are an Indian Ocean country. We have, we have wonderful divine assets given to us by geography that we should certainly develop and leverage much more effectively. And that includes the Andaman Nicobar Island chain, the Lucrative Islands. The position of the Andaman Nicobar Islands particularly is extremely strategic and important for India. And also the defense of the Andaman Nicobar Islands in the event of raised Chinese activity, because they overlook the Malacca Straits. And, during the Second World War, an aggressive revanchist Japan had occupied the Andaman Nicobar Islands. So, we have to be always alert to the defense of these islands, at the same time developing their capacity to be a most valuable strategic asset for us, because they overlook literally overlook the Southeast Asia region, the maritime environment of Southeast Asia, and are an outlet to the Indian Ocean.
Ma'am, one of the major reasons for SAARC failure is India-Pakistan rivalry. But it is also looked like that India lost its interest in SAARC after China became the observer of SAARC. How do you look at China's role when it comes to SAARC?
No, I don't think that India lost its interest after China became an observer in SAARC, because we continued with our activities to promote functional cooperation. Look at the South Asian University, the South Asian satellite, for instance. So that does not point to a lack of interest in the idea of SAARC or South Asian cooperation. It's true that the problems in our relations with Pakistan have made the advancement of SAARC's goals so much more difficult. But many of us are not aware how quietly SAARC has gone about promoting cooperation at functional levels between South Asia. I think we should not discount the achievements also of SAARC in that regard. And I'm sure the SAARC Secretariat which is in Kathmandu, would be best equipped to brief you about that. But India has gone out of its way also to help the LDCs within SAARC, in terms of dropping tariff barriers, in providing them with the support that they need in this regard. We have a framework agreement on energy cooperation that was signed during the Kathmandu summit. This was all very much after China became an observer in SAARC. So let's really look to, hopefully, after the abatement of COVID-19, I hope that we can really revive the SAARC concept again, operationalize many of the projects that we had begun. And if we can't, if Pakistan is not willing to cooperate, at least the other countries should get together and advance that kind of cooperation.
There's another interesting question, South China Sea. What is India's position on South China Sea? How is India looking at recent remark by Secretary Pompeo? South China Sea is not Chinese empire.
I think the words he used was, it's not the maritime empire of China. I think the 9-dash line on which China bases its claims to islands in the South China Sea, I don't believe they bring comfort to any country in the region, or for that matter, any country around the world, because it is so vaguely defined. It seems, a definition that China is just foisting on the rest of the region. It has led to tension, confrontation, and what the United States has now done is to say that they support the judgment of the Permanent Court of Arbitration as far as this dispute between the Philippines and China was concerned. Not so much on the rights and wrongs of the dispute over the islands per se, but the entire approach of China towards the maritime environment of the South China Sea, to this approach that it's my way or the highway, that really is not going to work. We need a proper code of conduct that does not mean that it is a code of conduct foisted on the region by China, but something that everybody sits down together and comes to an agreement about. Respect for international law, because all of us, I think, have a vested interest in promoting the rule of law around the world. It cannot be, the rules that are determined by one country alone. For instance, the 9-line, I mean, it really, if you were to operationalize it, it would turn the entire South China Sea into a Chinese lake. I'm sure no country will be able to accept that or come to terms with that. So we need a peaceful regime that is able to not only discuss these disputes more rationally, and also creates a modus vivendi for all the countries in the region to transact their business, to go about the activities, their legitimate activities in the region, and has respect for international law and the law of the sea. We have a law of the sea.
Ma'am, we still have lots of questions, but maybe I'll go with the last question for today. If you look at development projects in Nepal, most of the project promised by China has been completed on time, except few like Melamchi water project or ring road upgradation. However, many of the Indian projects in Nepal are long delayed, in fact, by decades. So what is the reason behind it?
If I'm not mistaken, India did undertake and complete a lot of small development projects that reached out even to the remote corners of Nepal, and we were able to work with people at the grassroots to bring benefits to them in a way that they wanted these benefits. Nothing was foisted on them. It's true some of the larger projects have not been completed. Sometimes it's because of delays on India's part, sometimes because the Nepalese authorities have reservations about these projects. So it's not, I don't want to apportion blame or responsibility. That's not, within my remit, as it were. But I think, we have to, as I said, sit down together and chart a long-term strategy for this relationship. Now we have this border issue also between the two countries. So there should be greater political will, I think, on both sides to craft that kind of mutually beneficial relationship. And Nepal has to decide what kind of relationship it wants with India. What are the benefits that it seeks in its relationship with India? I'm sure that India will be more than generous in accommodating Nepal's requests.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. Here we come to the end of the program. Thank you very much for your valuable time. We really learned a lot. It was really interesting and enlightening conversation. We would like to invite you again in future to talk on different issues. We'd also like to thank our participants for a wonderful question and participation. Thank you very much. Hope to see you at our next event. Good night.